Occupy Wall Street, the debt ceiling debate, unemployment, the crisis in Europe. That's just part of a very long list of economic issues that were front and center in 2011. Here with us to take a look at some of the most important economic developments of the year are Heidi Moore, the New York bureau chief and Wall Street correspondent for American Public Media's radio program Marketplace, and Roben Farzad, a senior writer for Bloomberg Businessweek. Hi, guys.
Hi.
How goes it?
So, Heidi, Occupy Wall Street. Did it have any impact on the economy? We know it impacted our politics.
I think it definitely did impact the financial system. I mean, if you take a look at, if you remember, banks tried to raise their debit card fees to $5, right? And they had this whole secret plan where they were just going to sneak it in. And because of Occupy Wall Street, people had become hyper aware of what banks were doing. And they actually protested, not people in Zuccotti Park or, camped out, but just regular people said, no, there's no reason for this. And they got the banks to roll it back. So we are seeing more attention paid to these financial issues.
Roben, what else?
I wish maybe it would have caught fire and convinced people that it wasn't just a niche movement, a catch basin for all the disaffected people. Those selling hemp iPad covers and hacky sacks and all these things. I mean, it never really gelled and crystallized to that point that forced Capitol Hill's hand or Congress's hand or the White House's hand. And you've seen it on a city-by-city basis, certainly here in New York, where locationally at least, that outrage was really pungent, and the backdrop was Wall Street there, and Wall Street having a fine year. You would think there would be a lot more outrage after people were evacuated, but there just wasn't.
Well, maybe they have not forced Congress's hand yet, but maybe there's a phase two in 2012. Do you see it?
I haven't seen a sort of a populist type candidate come up and say, a Nader type in previous years, or some sort of variation on a Ross Perot cross with a Ron Paul or something. We haven't seen it there largely in terms of a remedy, in terms of a new deal or a contract with America to address this disaffected crowd.
We've seen at least Elizabeth Warren.
Yes, exactly. I think it's worked far more subtly. I think it's kind of undermined from within. We're seeing income inequality as a major subject in this debate. Would we have seen that a few years ago? I don't think so. Would we have questioned the way that capitalism works in America a few years ago? We wouldn't. We're questioning our premises, and I think that's because a lot of people stood up and said there's something wrong with this system. And I think anyone who's intellectually honest, even people at the top of the system, understand this is not the way finance is supposed to work.
How about Wall Street itself? Occupy notwithstanding, there may be this casual assumption there about how well the 1%, meaning roughly Wall Street, continues to do post-bailout, but this year, maybe not so much?
Not so much. I mean, Wall Street is a cyclical business, right? It's been running on ego for a long time. They have riches and then they have famine, right? So this is going to be a famine year. It's been really tough for the investment banks to make money because all of this regulation has been asking them, what do you want to look like? What is the purpose of a bank? And they're having this identity crisis. I was reading a research report from Market Insights that said that this coming year we might have a gray swan event, right? So not a black swan, but a gray swan.
What is that?
Like, they were talking about maybe kind of a serious economic issue, maybe not as dire as the subprime crisis, but just slightly a notch below, probably something with Europe, right? And of course they meant, the gray being in degree, but if you look at a gray swan, what is that? That's a swan that's molting, right? It's growing new feathers. And that's what the financial system is doing too. It's having an identity crisis.
How metaphorical. Why didn't you just put that in haiku?
I was trying to, actually.
And how much of a crisis is Wall Street in?
There are lots of ways of looking at this. If you were to, sit down with Lloyd Blankfein and put 5 or 6 beers into him, and he'd tell you, look, times aren't great. It's fraught with uncertainty. I don't have prop trading. I'm losing some of my best talent. The scrutiny is there. Our partners can't have to be afraid if they're seen out together eating out at certain restaurants. There are actually these informal memos that go out and that don't be ostentatious. Look, we're on the public's S list, so kind of watch your back. And these guys would be saying that life isn't so great for me. But if you look at it the other way around, we're now in the throes of the 4th year of the Federal Reserve, and this is euphemistic, quote, recapitalizing the banking system, and largely doing that by keeping interest rates at zero, effectively throwing money at them and begging them to lend. And that gives rise to a dynamic where you're stealing from the poor, the savers, the widows and orphans, and giving banks essentially free money to go out and lend, and they're just pocketing it and adding cash to their balance sheets and banking that, and they're not going out and loaning it out.
Is that why we're not seeing jobs in the quote-unquote recovery?
It's a circular question. It's kind of a meaning of life, Tootsie Roll type question. Look, you hire people when you perceive that you can get an irresistible return on investment. There's so much slack in the economy right now, and parents are complaining. I invested a 4-year college private tuition for my kid, and that social compact has been broken. I can't send him to get a job. He can't be assured of anything. He's going to be an unpaid intern for several years. So there's this backlog really in the workforce where whether you subscribe to a 9% unemployment rate or a fully loaded 15% unemployment rate, no one's hiring nearly enough to get the unemployment rate down.
I think that's absolutely right, but I think you also have to take a look at, again, how brute force has forced the wheels of finance to start turning again. So what we've seen over the past 6 months is that banks are lending more to businesses. And what that means is that businesses are borrowing, which means they want to grow. And if they want to grow, they're eventually going to hire. I mean, it took a long time to get to that point, but we're getting there. We're seeing signs that things may turn around.
Europe, molting swans notwithstanding, how much does it matter?
It is everything. In this upcoming year, we are beholden to Europe's future. They control.
We are beholden to Europe's future?
We are. There's no way out. There's an interconnected
Is that
financial
Sartre?
system.
Jean Paul Sartre? No?
I believe
No?
it was
Oh,
that,
gosh.
and actually he said hell is Europe,
She's
but
so literary.
it's close
Gosh,
enough.
Heidi.
But
Those other continents. Go ahead.
right, exactly. But the whole worldwide financial system is interconnected. When we suffered, Europe's banks had to protect themselves. Now Europe's banks are suffering because they're connected to their countries. Their countries are in trouble. They don't know if the euro is going to survive. And it would be completely unrealistic to believe that we could come through that unscathed unless they figure out what they're going to do about the Eurozone. If they fix that, then we're okay. But any trouble, we'll see.
Are they going to fix it? Is there any treaty, and there are all these treaties that keep being debated, is there any treaty that can really fix it? The deal of future austerity for a bailout now, is even that going to matter?
It seems like every Monday they come together for photo op diplomacy and say, this is it. This is the cordon sanitaire. We're finally going to nip this thing in the bud. And the market might subscribe to it for all of 3 hours, and then concerns start weighing down all over again. So they've lost, I think, this window of opportunity to really present true shock and awe to the global financial markets and say, we are willing, especially with the European Central Bank, the ECB, to break the long-held taboos of monetary policy in the continent and go out and flood the map with cheap euros.
And housing, is the government helpless to do anything about stopping the foreclosure crisis, defining the bottom of the housing market to help it turn around?
Yeah, well, they're not getting any help, right? I mean, one of the things that we're seeing with the Federal Reserve is that even now it's trying to figure out what the bank's exposures are, U.S. banks' exposures are to Europe, right? They don't know, so they're putting the banks through stress tests. Now, the banks still own a whole bunch of housing debt. They might take on more. They might take on jumbo mortgages that are, people who are well capitalized who take out big mortgages. But right now, we don't even know the extent of the problem to this day, right? We have all this unused housing stock. We have numbers like you wouldn't believe, but we don't really know who deserves reparations, who needs to be spending, how much of this needs to be turned over or rented or whatever it is. The numbers are deceiving because when you have a number, you believe you know. But all of the numbers we have about the housing crisis still haven't told us how to get to the root of it.
There's a real eye-opening 60-minute segment last night on suburban Cleveland actually tearing down homes in order to save the housing market there, in order to give people some sort of bottom in terms of valuation for their homes, because you have thieves ripping out the copper pipes and the appliances and the kitchen sink, and that sadly is what these homes are worth.
And by tearing down the homes, they're reducing the supply to increase the price of the remaining homes?
Yeah, it's not unlike the USDA paying corn farmers to destroy a portion of their crop in order to equilibrate the market.
And Congress, gridlock is what we hear, but they're torn between two, necessary attractions. And one is to spend money to try to jumpstart the economy, and the other is to save money because the deficit is so big. How do they ever resolve it?
I don't know. The market is sending.
That's the first time I ever saw you look to another guest for help.
I ask Heidi Moore for help in this. This is one of the great questions of our time, I think, in that since the time the United States had its credit rating downgraded by S&P, all manner of U.S. financial assets have rallied. There's been a flight to safety in U.S. Treasuries. You'd think that the opposite would be true, the obverse would be true. the whole world is falling apart. And I interviewed a bond manager this week who said that we're just the prettiest horse in the glue factory at that point. And I think that pretty much tells the story right now. It's a lesser of evils and ugliness. And we're not paying the price for that perceived profligacy. And in hindsight, people look back at that at folly and they say that that shouldn't have been our primary concern because the jobless rate is still front and center.
We've got the molten swans, we've got the prettiest horses in the glue factory, and unfortunately, we have to leave it there for tonight. Heidi, Roben, thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, filmmaker Paul Verhoeven. He may need a RoboCop to protect him from those who disagree, but his basic instinct tells him that Jesus was a great revolutionary leader, but just a man.